Very good. I think we'll get started. It's not every day that we have the warden of St. Anthony's College here, so I'm not surprised we have a full overflow crowd today for our Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the Center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you. Welcome back, many of you, but also see some new faces, which is great. As always, I want to up front, before I introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Margaret Mcmillan, would like to acknowledge the support of the National History Center as a co-sponsor, co-organizer for this Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs, and of course, Roger Lewis, as the co-chair, co-directs the seminar with me. I'm delighted also to acknowledge the support of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, who help us with the seminar, and last but not least, Marian Barber and the Assistant Director at the National History Center right here, and Alison Lilakoff in the back, and her team for helping to put together this event, get the word out, get all of you here, and so forth. Next week, Jeffrey Herf from the University of Maryland will be talking about anti-Zionism in Germany. I'll have to excuse myself once again. I'll be in Korea with the center's president, so you will be at the sole mercy of Roger next week. And then we're looking, quickly coming up to the end of our series for this semester with Tony Smith on April 30th and Kenton Clymer, our fellow here at the Wilson Center, on May 7th. So look forward to seeing all of you, many of you, I hope, for those events. Now, on to our guest speaker. It's just really an honor and a great pleasure to have with us today Professor Margaret Mcmillan, who, as I mentioned, is the warden of St. Anthony's College and professor of international history at Oxford University, really one of the leading lights in our profession. She is a fellow at the Royal Society of Literature and an officer of the Order of Canada. She has also served as provost of Trinity College and professor of history at the University of Toronto and at Ryerson University. She's a leading expert on history and international relations and frequently comments in the media. She has a long distinguished publication record to her credit. Let me just name a number of her most important publications. She's the author of Peacemakers, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and its attempt to end war, also published as Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World in 2002, which won the Duff Cooper Prize for Outstanding Literary Work in the Field of History, Biography and Politics. It also won the Hessel-Tiltman Prize for History and the prestigious Samuel Johnson Prize for the Best Work of Nonfiction published in the United Kingdom, and the 2003 Governors General's Literary Award in Canada. Her other publications include Women of the Raj, 1988, Nixon and Mao, The Week That Changed the World, published 2007, and most recently, The Uses and Abuses of History. My hope is that perhaps our discussion on the outbreak of World War I can then spill over into a broader discussion based on this, in particular, this book. She has degrees from the University of Toronto and a BPhil and a DPhil from Oxford University. It's with just great pleasure that I give her the floor, not before, though, turning things over to Roger for additional introductory comments and other things. Roger.
Just to say a word about St. Anthony's College. The purpose of the college is modern history and area studies. That is its purpose, and that virtually makes it unique. Ken Mcdonald is among the founding generation of St. Anthony's, and there, I'm sure, are other Antonians in the audience. Margaret Mcmillan, with her work on Women in the Raj, the Paris Peace Conference, her work on China, made her a very appropriate warden of the college, and she also happens to be the first Canadian warden of St. Anthony's. We do have a ritual of going around and letting everyone introduce themselves briefly. If you wish to proclaim that you are a Canadian, there's no one that will bar you from it. Marion, could we begin with you?
I'm Marion Barber from the National History Center.
Ken McDonald, retired CIA.
Chandler McDonald, Department of State.
Michael Dobbs, a former reporter and writer.
Al Schmidt, presently visiting scholar at GW and a life member of the HA for 60 years.
I'm Sang Yun Ma. I'm very glad to meet you, warden of the St. Anthony, where I studied for many years. I'm currently a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Bruce Houston, former history teacher.
Margaret Smith, American University, International Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution.
Dennis Clark, I'm a doctoral student at Oxford.
Randall Doyle, Laogai Research Foundation.
Alice Freifeld, University of Florida, and I'm presently at the center.
Yafeng Xia, I'm currently a fellow at the center. Otherwise, I teach history at Northern University in Brooklyn, New York. I like your Nixon and Mao. Thank you.
I'm Mickey Fabry. I'm a fellow here at the center. I teach international affairs at Georgia Tech, and I'm Canadian.
I'm Kent Hughes, run a program here at the Center on America and the global economy, and I have relatives in Canada.
Don Wolfensberger, I run the Congress program here, and I fished in Canada.
Adrian Steffen, retired Foreign Service officer, and my mother was Canadian.
Robert Mahoney, retired from Catholic University in Washington.
I'm Kathy Rasmussen. I'm with the Office of the Historian at the Department of State, and I took my PhD in Canadian history.
Christine Warbeck, Northern Illinois University, fellow Canadian, University of Toronto.
Anthony Joyce, former MA graduate at UTexas under Dr. Lewis.
Michael Neufeld, Smithsonian, and also a Canadian.
Karen Livenbeck, Franciscan Monastery and the International Virgin Wolf Society.
I'm Pat Harahan, a military historian.
Jim Banner, historian.
Stanley Falk, military historian.
Tom Hughes, former president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, once at Balliol College.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center scholar.
Anna Nelson, History Department, American University.
Anita Jones, retired director, American Historical Association. I've been accosted in Canada by the FBI doing a background check for the White House.
Gosh.
Madalena Lee, PhD student at the University of Maryland.
Charles Smith, University of Arizona, Middle East historian.
Bill Burr, National Security Archive.
Stephen Shore with the PBGC.
Chalmers Hood, French historian, doing a biography of Darlan, and a great fan of Zeldin.
I'm Marley Clymer. I'm a retired nurse, and my goal is to get back to beautiful Newfoundland.
John Garrity, retired U.S. government.
Marvin Ott, Center, Johns Hopkins University. No known Canadian connection, but do have a place in Maine.
Kenton Clymer, I'm a fellow here at the Center.
Jim Walker, retired and student of history.
Lynn Walker, retired securities.
Joe Brinley with Woodrow Wilson Center Press.
Petro Prish, Wilson Center Scholar.
I'm Giwon Gon, Wilson Center Scholar.
I'm Steve Lagerfeld, editor.
And also government historian.
Robert Litvak from the Wilson Center.
Ronald Steele, University of Southern California.
Ranch Majumdar, St. Anthony's College.
David Kyvig, former Wilson Fellow and married to a Canadian.
Jane Hughes, former VOA broadcaster. My first foreign country was Canada.
Liaqat Ahmed, economic historian.
Corey Caldwell, intern at the National History Center.
Christine Kelly, intern at the National History Center.
Margaret Mcmillan on the outbreak of World War I.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's always a lovely excuse to come to Washington, and wonderful to talk to people who are so interested in history. And I'm very interested to see the Canadian connection. I mean, I think the United States should be more worried than it is. We're taking over very quietly. You don't notice us, but we're everywhere, it seems. Anyway, the First World War, people talk about causes or events being overdetermined, and in a way the outbreak of the First World War is not just overdetermined, it's overexplained. We have endless explanations. The debates go on. I think they never really will be settled if we're looking at questions such as whose fault was it, who could have stopped it, why did it happen when it did. It's been estimated that there's something like 33,000 books in English alone on the origins of the First World War, and I can believe it. If you go to any library, you will see rows of books on the outbreak of World War I, and if you look for a similar section on the outbreak of World War II, you'll see something very much shorter, and I think we're much more in agreement on how the Second World War started than we are on the First World War. I think we continue to try and explain it, partly because it is very complicated to work out both the sequence and the meaning of events and try and assign responsibility. We continue to try and do that because it was such an appalling event in modern history. I mean, the world quite literally was different after the First World War. I mean, we can say the same about the Second World War, but in a way what happened in the First World War helped to make the circumstances within which the Second World War took place. And I won't go through with you because you all know it, the scale of the destruction, both physical and loss of human life, and the lingering effects on the generations who came afterwards, the changes in the map of Europe, but also in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, the tremendous change in the position of Europe in the world, in that small part of the world, particularly Western Europe, which had been so dominant, which had controlled so much of the world's land territory, so much of the world's population, which had controlled so much of the world's wealth, shipping, communications, and so on, was now seriously weakened. And I think we really can trace the decline of Europe as a center of world power back to the First World War. We can look also at the legacy of cynicism and violence which was left, and which left in turn its mark on the European politics of the 1920s and 1930s. And of course, perhaps the most appalling thing of all when you look back was that it didn't actually seem to settle anything. It left a whole number of unanswered questions which were going to produce tensions, and in turn there was going to be another war. And so I think there is a sense that someone must, or something must have been responsible for this. And part of the attempt to explain the First World War has been a search for the guilty. It's still happening. There's a new book coming out by a historian based in Turkey called Sean McMeekin, and I saw the advertisement for it, and it said, Sean is going to name names and point fingers. I mean, it sounds like a bad television show. But this is still, I think, an impulse. And, of course, it's been kept alive also by contemporary political issues. It was kept alive after the First World War by the whole question of German guilt. I mean, if it was the case that Germany was guilty, then it was legitimate that Germany should pay reparations. If it was not the case, then there was something very wrong with the peace settlements, and that is a debate which has gone on to the present day. There is also the sense that when people try and explain it, that it may just be some ghastly design flaw in human nature, that we take something very good and slither over the edge, as Lloyd George put it, who was later to be British Prime Minister. We slither over the abyss, slither over the edge into disaster. It, of course, remains, I think, important for our day because we live with a fear that we might do something similar. And I think this was a very live fear in the Cold War, that deterrence would fail and that there would be an incident, the Cuban Missile Crisis perhaps, or the Middle East War of 1973, or the shooting down of KAL 007 later on, that would lead to the same catastrophic series of decisions, and we would get an all-out war with even, of course, more ghastly consequences in the First World War. And I think in our present circumstances, when we're living in a very uncertain world, I think, in many ways, a world in which power structures are shifting, where it's not quite clear what the new international power structure is going to look like. Will China become a hegemonic power, or will it remain an East Asian power? What will India do? What role will India play on the world stage, or will it continue to be mainly an Asian power? What is the future role of the United States in this world? Will it encounter some of the same difficulties that Britain was encountering before the First World War and certainly after the First World War with imperial overstretch? And so I think we remain interested in the First World War, not just because it was such a catastrophic event in modern history, but we remain interested in it because we fear, I think, with some reason, that we may, if we're not careful, do something similar. And I think it will continue to be the case that we remain interested in it. I know there are a number of books coming out on the outbreak. One's coming out this year. There'll be others coming out next year. And I think that reflects not just the fact that publishers love anniversaries, and the big anniversary of 2014 is coming up, but because it simply remains one of those puzzles in international relations, in international history, which continues to have resonance in the present. The current state of the scholarship, I think, is that there is no clear explanation as to why it started. There are a number of explanations. There is, I think, more or less agreement among historians that Germany played a considerable role in the circumstances which made the war possible. The start of the Anglo-German naval race, for example, was clearly a key factor in forcing Britain to look for allies and helping to divide Europe up into two competing alliance systems. But it is possible, when you start looking at it, to lay a share of the blame on Austria-Hungary for its determination to deal with Serbia, its determination to survive at whatever cost, or as one Austro-Hungarian minister said, our determination to commit suicide. I think this we can look at. We can look, and people are looking at the Russian role in the in the events leading up to the First World War. And as you know, and again, I'm just going to mention them briefly because I want to get on to the questions I think are important, there are all sorts of explanations. I mean, there are the explanations about the impersonal forces, the forces which simply seem to predetermine or preordain that there would be a world war. There are the economic explanations, that this was really about a competition for markets. I mean, that was certainly a favorite Marxist explanation. They tend to fall down when you examine them in more detail, which is what we do as historians. I mean, Great Britain and Germany were each other's biggest trading partners. And so to argue that they were engaged in a deadly competition for economic supremacy, you could argue that they were so closely linked to each other that, in fact, such a competition made no sense. We also get the explanations about balance of power in the alliance system. Was this a breakdown in the balance of power? And you could argue this, but I think, again, when you examine, and I'm happy to say more about this in questions if people want, when you examine the alliance system, it was a defensive alliance system, and it was not all that tight. I mean, Britain was not obliged to come into a war if France and Russia got into a war. Italy was not obliged to come into a war if its alliance partners of Austria-Hungary and Germany got into war, except under very special circumstances. And Italy, in fact, chose not to come into the war. The other thing about alliances is, how do you enforce them? I mean, even if you have a tight alliance which says, I will come to your defense if you're attacked, if you choose not to come, you may indeed face a certain amount of opprobrium. But is there anything that anyone can do to force you to come into war that you don't want to come into? And so I think to put the blame on the alliance system, again, seems to me an incomplete or unsatisfactory explanation. Armaments, the arms race, again, you could argue that this was a factor, and it certainly helped raise a level of tension. But from the point of view of armaments manufacturers, really what they prefer is a state of armed tension to an outright war in many cases, because it's better for trade and you can sell to both sides, as many of them were doing. The growth of nation states and nationalism, again, this is clearly a factor, but can we put all responsibility on that? And clearly, it makes a difference that Germany becomes a nation. And I think this is probably important. Not that the new German nation was necessarily bound on war, but the situation of the new German nation sitting at the center of Europe, becoming very rapidly an economic power, was, and it's a question we've continued to deal with since, was an issue which the rest of Europe had to deal with, and an issue which Germany itself had to deal with. Sometimes domestic factors have been blamed. Was war seen as a desirable way of uniting the country, of overcoming what were in many cases deep domestic divisions? I mean, in a number of European countries, there were really considerable fears about the growth of socialist movements, for example, or the growth of nationalist movements. Austria-Hungary was facing its own disintegration. I mean, nationalism for Austria-Hungary was a death sentence, and I think the ruling elites in Austria-Hungary realized this. There have been endless arguments, which I could go on for hours about, but you'll be relieved to know I won't, about military plans. And were the European powers locked into such tight military plans that they had no alternative once the sort of doomsday machinery started rolling, but to let it all happen? And I don't think so. Again, when you start examining the details, I mean, I've spent some time on railway timetables, which is fascinating, but I won't share it with you at the moment, to your relief. But, the argument made was that once the railway timetables, once the mobilization timetables started, we can't shift them because there'll be chaos. Except during the First World War, they shifted huge numbers of troops from one front to another on very short notice, and there wasn't chaos. They had learnt to run their railways. So, it seems to me that all these explanations, and I'm sure some of you will think of others, are all good, but they still don't explain why in July 1914, European statesmen, and we do get down to a number of people, why European statesmen decided that war was a reasonable alternative. And they did so knowing that there might well be a general European war. They often went into the war, particularly Austria-Hungary, for particularly local reasons, in Austria-Hungary's case to deal with Serbia. But they knew very well that they were risking the possibility of a general European war. And so I think the two questions which I think are perhaps more interesting than who was to blame, or who or what was to blame. First of all, why did they think that war was a realistic option in 1914, and what were they thinking when they did it? What was it that made them think this is worth risking? And I think these are important. That is an important question. A second way, I think, of looking at it is why, rather than saying why did the war break out, why did the peace fail? I mean, Europe had enjoyed a period of peace really unprecedented in its modern history. Unprecedented, I would say, since the Roman Empire. Since 1815, it had been pretty much free from war. Now, we can all think of the exceptions. There was a series of short wars of German unification and Italian unification, but they were short, and they ended quickly, and they ended with decisive battles, and they ended with agreements. There were wars on the periphery of Europe, such as the Crimean War, and there were wars in the non-European world. But Europe itself really had an extraordinary century when it really did not suffer the horrors of war in the ways that it had suffered in the 18th century, certainly in the 17th century, and was going to suffer in the 20th century. So why did the peace fail? Why were they unable to continue to manage what had been quite a successful system of international relations? And they had survived other crises which might have resulted in general war. So what I am trying to do, and what I'd like to do now and spend a bit of time on, is try and understand what was in the minds of those who are making the decisions. Now, we have to put them in their own societies and in their own worlds. I mean, we cannot take them out of those worlds. And clearly the forces which are pushing them and the intellectual currents which are shaping their thinking, the political currents that are shaping their thinking, are enormously important. But when we get right down to July 1914, we also get down to not that many people. I mean, each country, a handful of men, are the ones who say, yes, we will go ahead, we will order the mobilization, or no, we won't. And I think that importance of, at certain crisis moments in history, at looking at the individuals, has been, I think, borne in on us again in the events after September the 11th. I think if we had had different people in Downing Street, if we'd had different people in the Elysee Palace, if we'd had different people clearly in Washington, the decisions that were made after the dreadful events of September the 11th might have been different. The invasion of Afghanistan and the attempt to punish the Taliban, I think, probably was something that was almost certainly going to happen. But the subsequent decisions, the decision to invade and occupy Iraq, I think, was very much shaped by those who were actually making the decisions. I mean, my view is that we have become aware yet again of the importance at certain moments, not all, but at certain moments, of the individuals who are actually in the position to say, yes, we will do it, or no, we won't. Now, there are many things one can pick out in the Europe of the 19th century, because it was a very rich century. It was a century of tremendous intellectual ferment and tremendous debate. But I'd like to pick out four things which I think helped to shape the statesmen who were making the decisions. And I'd like to just stress that these were often things that had happened in the 1860s or 1870s or 1880s. They didn't necessarily reflect the latest thinking in 1914, but these were people who had been formed in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And I think this is important to remember. New things were happening. We all know that there were very exciting new things happening in European thought. But the people who were actually at the summit of the decision-making processes in their societies were in their 50s and 60s, in some cases even older. I mean, the Austrian emperor was much older. He was in his 80s. And so they were shaped really by the ideas and thoughts of a previous generation. And the four things I'd like to pick out, first of all, faith in progress. Now, this was something that was accepted in Europe, and it seemed to make sense. As Europeans looked at their society, looked at their tremendous growth in power, their tremendous growth in prosperity, the tremendous advances in science and technology that had been made, the spread of prosperity, the spread of communications. I mean, we all can think of the things that were happening in Europe. I think many of them were convinced that society was moving ahead. I mean, there was a real faith, and again, there were the naysayers, but there was a real faith, I would argue, among most Europeans of a certain age in progress, that the world was becoming a better and a richer place and that human societies were progressing. And, of course, you know how that played out. I mean, there was a belief that some had already progressed further up the ladder of evolution than others. Western European societies tended to think they were further along. They sometimes included the Italians. They sometimes had questions about Italy. Did it belong in this scale of progress? But it wasn't racialist necessarily. I mean, there was also a very strong belief accompanying the idea in progress that there was a unity of humanity, but that simply some peoples in humanity had progressed further than others. Eventually all would progress, and the progression would go on. I mean, it was a very optimistic belief that there was a progression into the future. It was linear, and it was going to move ahead. And that, I think, was very important, a faith that they were getting better. And where that was going to matter when it came to war crises was that quite often people simply refused to believe that they could do anything so stupid as go to war. And if you believe in progress, if you believe that humanity is getting more sensible and more intelligent and more capable, then when you get into a crisis, you think, well, we'll sort it out. You know, we cannot be so foolish as to contemplate a war. Now, Stefan Zweig, the German novelist, has a wonderful passage in his autobiography where he says, we lived in a golden age and we thought it was all going to get better, and we could not believe that anything as barbaric as war would happen again. I mean, that was in the past. We'd moved beyond that. So I think this is important. There was also a belief, allied to the belief in progress, in positivism, that science could discover all, that it was possible to discover everything. It could discover what rocks were made of, but it could also discover what the human spirit was made of. And if, again, this, I think, is a very important belief. I think there was a tendency to downplay the irrational factors in humanity, which again made it difficult for statesmen to take them into account. I mean, they might have been aware of them, but I think they thought that all things could be solved, that you could work out. I mean, this is the era in the late 19th century when political science is founded as a separate discipline, sociology is established as a discipline, statistics becomes more and more important. The sense that we can measure everything, account for everything, understand everything. Tied again to this, and these are all overlapping, is social Darwinism, which is tied into this notion I mentioned earlier of human societies evolving. And this was a belief that just as Darwin and the evolutionary scientists could explain how species were formed, and it could explain why some disappeared and some survived, so too you could apply those measurements and those ideas and those concepts to human society. And tied into social Darwinism, and this was taken very much from Darwin's thought, was the notion of the struggle for survival. And this was, in a way, dangerous, because if you believe that human society is moving forward, if you believe in social evolution, then someone's going to get left behind, perhaps not deliberately, but there may be peoples who just can't keep up. And it may be that the mechanism through which human society progresses is through struggle and through conflict. And social Darwinism was, in fact, very strong among military thinkers and among a number of statesmen. I've been struck at how much it informs their thought. Let me just read to you a brief thing that Conrad von Hotzendorf, the chief of staff of the Austro-Hungarian armies, wrote at the outbreak of the war. This was in his memoirs. He said, whatever the context was, the events which led to a general war turn out to be only phenomena of the struggle for survival, the driving force in everything. And so although there's a belief in progress, there's also this other side of it, that progress may come at a cost to some people, and there may be this mechanism through which progress occurs. And of course, again tied into this, and this is the fourth of the things I'd like to look at, so belief in progress, belief in positivism, belief in social Darwinism, nationalism. Because for a lot of people in 19th century Europe, the nation was the highest form of organization of a people. And nations were moving along this linear progress, and nations often were locked into this struggle for survival. I mean, if you look at the growth of nationalism, and the growth of historians, I think, play a part in this. I mean, we like to think of ourselves as standing outside events and helping to cast enlightenment. But when you think of the role that historians played in 19th century Europe, they in fact played a hugely important role in creating national histories and creating national stories and in portraying their nation as somehow surviving and conquering and being right. Heinrich von Treitschke, the great German historian, was hugely influential on a generation of German thinkers. And he was read by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who approved of his ideas. And what Treitschke argued among other things, was that Prussia was the highest form of human civilization, and that the unification of Germany by Prussia was a great step forward for humanity, and that Prussians should be aware of this and should be proud of the role that Prussia had played in creating Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm liked von Treitschke's ideas, but didn't like him because he didn't give the Hohenzollerns a key leading role in all this. So Wilhelm did not approve of that. Von Moltke, the younger German chief of staff at the outbreak of the First World War, read von Treitschke as a young man and wrote to his wife, "I have never been so captivated by a work of history." He wrote to her, "A spirit of patriotism and love of the German fatherland drifts through the whole work without violating historical truth. It is superb." And so you get this harnessing of history to nationalism, which helps to feed into it. And what you get also with the development of nationalism, and of course it's tied up with some of the other great social changes, the spread of communications, the growth of mass education, the growth of a mass readership, mass newspapers, mass journals, cheap periodicals, cheap books. What you get also is the growth of stereotypes about other nations. I mean, you see your history in a particular way, and you see your relations with other peoples in another way. I mean, French intellectuals, of course, did not see Prussia as a glorious forerunner of the advancing humanity. French intellectuals were fascinated by what they called le Prussien, by which they meant nothing good. They meant a sinister force in human history. A French sociologist, for example, says the trouble with the Prussians is they are essentially rootless. They live in a very flat land. They've moved across back and forth through the centuries in history, which indeed was true. What it has meant, he said, is the Prussians have no fixed moral standards, and they're much more malleable in the hands of their leaders. This was work being done in universities. So you get a growth in nationalism, which both elevates your own people to some position in the forefront of humanity, and you also get a tendency to look at other nations in a way which downplays their value, or which sees them again in this Darwinian struggle as something that you have to overcome. So I think what you get is ways of thinking which don't rule out the possibility of war, which say that war may simply be a part of what we think is happening. We've proved it scientifically. It's just one of those things that's going to happen. Another thing which you can't really call a type of thought, but which I think is very important in this period, is fear. We see Europe as a confident society and a rich society, and we look back and we see all these measurements of success, and they're all there. But it never comes easily. Change never comes easily. And there were real stresses in these societies, stresses posed by urbanization, and the growth of new classes, the growth of new wealth. And what you got in most European societies was a fear, particularly on the part of the old elites, that they were losing their power. And indeed they were. I mean, if you relied on landed estates for your wealth, that increasingly was not a source of wealth. The new sources of wealth were in industry. They were in the cities. They were in finance. They were in trade. Particularly with the opening up of new agricultural productions in the New World, European agricultural prices went into a fall from which they really didn't recover until the First World War itself. So there were fears of losing status, fears that your role in society, if you were in the privileged elites, was no longer what it was. You were no longer controlling society, no longer controlling all its wealth, no longer controlling politics. In most European countries, the franchise was being widened. And so what it meant was that increasingly the old dominance by the landed elites of politics, of the highest levels of society, of the judiciary, of the civil service, of the foreign office, of the military, was being challenged. Fears of the working classes. I mean, these were new and big classes that were appearing, and they were beginning, of course, by 1900 to get themselves organized. You're beginning to get unions forming. You're beginning to get, in some countries, increasingly violent strikes. You're beginning to get the growth of working-class parties. Would they be part of the nation in the same way that the old elites felt that they had been? And one of the big fears, of course, was that if a war broke out, would they come if called? Because by 1900, virtually every European army, with the exception of the British, depended on conscription. And there was a real fear that the conscripts, the people who were filling the ranks, might not be reliable material. There was also fears of the impacts of industrialization and urbanization. I mean, there was a nostalgia for the country life, which, of course, was fine if you were in the upper classes, not so great if you were in the peasant classes. And most of the peasants had shown what they thought about the glories of country life by moving into the cities as soon as they got a chance and there were jobs for them to do. But there were quite widespread fears that for all the faith in progress, that something was beginning to go wrong, that the race might be degenerating. There was a very popular book by a German writer in the 1890s called Degeneration, and the title really tells you all. There was a worry that people were getting too comfortable. A famous German military authority wrote in a study on a very, very widely used book of tactics. He said, the steadily improving standards of living tend to increase the instinct of self-preservation and to diminish the spirit of self-sacrifice. The fast manner of living at the present day undermines the nervous system. The fanaticism and religious and national enthusiasm of a bygone age are lacking. And finally, the physical prowess of the human species are also partly diminishing. So tied up with this faith, or the underside of this faith in progress, was perhaps that it is undercutting us and making us less capable of doing what we should do. And you got partly as a response to this, again, I think a lot of it driven by an old elite or elites, which is feeling that it's losing its grip, and partly this fear of the impact of modern society, you get a marked spread of militarism, meaning not the military, but the spread of military values throughout societies. I mean, you see it even in the photographs. I mean, it strikes one as very odd now to see how many European political leaders wore military uniform, certainly in Germany, certainly in Russia. I mean, these days, if a head of state appeared, apart from Saddam Hussein or Idi Amin or a dictator, appeared in military uniform, we'd all think there was something very strange about this and see it as a rather sinister sign. But if you look at the Europe of the pre-1914 period, there is a permeation of military values and admiration for military values. Even the growth of movements, or perhaps especially the growth of movements like the Boy Scouts, were very much a conscious decision to try and get the young, get them inculcated with military values such as discipline, self-sacrifice, obedience, the ability to take hardship. I mean, these were seen as ways of counteracting the pernicious effects of urbanization. Syrian Hamilton, who later on presided over, or helped to preside over the disaster at Gallipoli in the First World War, said before the First World War, from the nursery and its toys to the Sunday school and its cadet company, every influence of affection, loyalty, tradition, and education should be brought to bear on the next generation of British boys and girls so as deeply to impress upon their young minds a feeling of reverence and admiration for the patriotic spirit of their ancestors. And this was not just some crank on the outside. This was a fairly widespread view that we need to somehow bring these values more into society. A further way in which people were thinking which I think is important. I mean, I think the ways in which they were thinking about human society, its evolution, its movement through time, the fears which they had that perhaps they were beginning to degenerate, that their own societies were lacking. A further very important way of thinking, which helped to shape the decisions that led to the disaster in 1914, was the way, of course, they were thinking about war. And this is one of the things which I find absolutely fascinating. I mean, most people assumed, those who were responsible for thinking about war in the military academies, in the general staffs of the European powers, in the universities where there were beginning to be chairs of military studies, in the informed press, where people were talking about war, they were still assuming that it would be a short war. Some people were beginning to suspect that this might not be the case. But the prevailing view, which was very strongly held, and I think held with increasing desperation, actually, as the counter-evidence mounted, was that the war would be short. And you probably all know the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton, the great Antarctic explorer, who went off from South Georgia Island in August 1914, just as things were beginning to unfold in Europe, went off to explore the Antarctic, spent the winter there, came back in the summer of 1915, and landed at South Georgia Island, and his first question was, well, who won the war? And they said, it's still on. He said, no, don't be funny. It can't be. You know, and that, I think, reflects a very widespread view that the war would be like the Franco-Prussian War, at least in its early stage. German army or Prussian armies, plus their allies, come into France. There's a series of battles, final decisive battle at Sedan, the French surrender, and eventually a peace is made. That was the sort of war that you would be getting. There was, of course, an appreciation of changing technologies. People did understand that firepower was much greater, and the capacity to deliver firepower was not just greater, but it could be delivered over a much greater distance, that it was getting more difficult to attack, and that such simple things as the spade and barbed wire were making it possible for armies to dig themselves in, put up defenses in front of them, whether sandbags or barbed wire or mines or a combination of all of the above, and therefore it was more difficult to get at them. But I think we see in the reaction of those who had to deal with this unfortunate and perhaps admirable human capacity to ignore inconvenient evidence. And what they didn't look at, and they should have done, was the American Civil War, where there were terrible losses, where it was very difficult to attack. What they didn't look at enough and should have done was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, where again the Japanese took tremendous losses attacking dug-in Russian positions. When those wars were looked at, and when people said, look, something is changing in the nature of war, it's getting much, much more difficult to attack, we may have to start thinking defensively, the answer almost invariably was, those are not good examples. Those were Americans fighting each other. We all know they're not a military people. Or those were Russians, the weakest of the European powers, fighting the Japanese, who are, after all, an Asian power. And so I think you see before 1914 a really, not determined, I don't think they were doing it consciously, but simply an ability to explain away inconvenient evidence. And I'll just give you one nice example of this. There was a Russian-Polish banker called Ivan Bloch, who was a great tycoon, very, very thoughtful, had become really concerned about the future impact of war on Europe and wrote a massive study of this, convinced that firepower was making the odds enormous in favor of the defense. He argued that it would need 8-to-1 advantage for the attacker to overcome a well-entrenched, well-armed defense. The advantage, he believed, had gone very, very firmly to the defensive. And he came in 1901 to speak at the United Services Institute in London. And I've read accounts of that meeting, and he faced a very angry bunch of British military men. One of them, one major general, walked out saying, this is so-called non-jingoism or non-militarism, namby-pamby so-called humanitarianism. I mean, they did not want to hear what people like Ivan Bloch was saying, and they could dismiss him because he was a civilian. What do civilians know about this? To try and deal with the very real prospect that the defense was getting stronger, you got what one American historian has called the cult of the offensive, that we simply need to attack with a bit more enthusiasm, more men, we have to train them better, they have to have more discipline, we need to inculcate a spirit in them of being prepared to take sacrifices. They have to know that they will take hideous sacrifices. If cavalry are going to have trouble charging across the field, we get bigger horses and faster horses. We don't even change the uniforms. There was a huge debate in France about the red trousers of the French soldiers, and some people said, look, maybe red trousers on a battlefield does provide a nice target, and the answer was, mais le pantalon rouge, c'est le français, c'est la France. You know, we are the red pantaloons. And so these poor French soldiers went into 1914, of course got shot, and then the trousers were changed. A lot of officers simply would not study the defensive. A leading major British general said in 1914, the defensive is never an acceptable role to the Briton, and he makes little or no study of it. And that was said with pride. And so what you got were assumptions about a short war. You got assumptions that war was, in fact, something that happened in human history. You even got assumptions that war was rather good for society, that it was healthy, that it would stimulate a feeling of patriotism, it would get the young who were getting a bit too soft, it would give them something to fight for, that you couldn't really advance, and this goes back to my notion of progress being an important thing, you couldn't really advance without a good, healthy bloodletting every so often. Of course, this was usually said by people who were well beyond military age. It wasn't their blood that was necessarily going to be let. Just to quote one more German thinker, von Bernhardi, who talked a lot about war. He wrote a famous work called Germany in the Coming War, which sold in many, many copies and was translated. He said, during a period of peace, all petty and personal interests force their way to the front. Selfish and intrigue run riot, and luxury obliterates idealism. War is a biological necessity of the first element, a regulative element in the life of mankind which cannot be dispensed with, since without it an unhealthy development will follow. And those, again, are not fringe views. These are views which, of course, not everyone shared. I mean, there were people in Europe who thought this was absolutely ridiculous. There was a big peace movement. A number of the unions and left-wing movements came together in the Second International, which met regularly and said that it would oppose a war. You had huge peace movements, funded in some cases by people like Alfred Nobel and Andrew Carnegie, who may have had slightly guilty consciences about what they'd been producing up to this point. Unfortunately, I think the very success of Europe made a number of those who opposed war think it probably can't happen anyway. You know, the soldiers are talking away. They're wrong. War is so unlikely. And there was a very important sense that war had simply become something that Europe couldn't afford. European economies were so closely intertwined. European trade was so important to everyone. How could you have a war? You couldn't continue it. I mean, one of the most important books that was written expressing this point of view before the war was Norman Angell, The Great Illusion. He said, we just can't have a war. It just doesn't make sense. And we're sensible people. Well, so we get this in 1914. You get these different pressures. You get anticipations of war. You get thinking about war. You also get, I think, again, among the people who are going to make the decisions, almost a fatalistic spirit. They don't know what else to do. They think the war might be dreadful. It's not that they all thought it would be good, but I think there's also a sense that if we don't go to war, we lose. And it's difficult to measure, but it's important for nations. Prestige. Can we afford to back down? And this is, I haven't got time to go through it, but this is where the previous history comes in. A number of nations had backed down in previous crises. Over Bosnia, for example, Russia had backed down. And I think there was a feeling in Russia, never again. Over Serbia, Austria-Hungary had backed down in 1912, and I think there was a feeling, never again. There was also, I think, a feeling that we might miss a window of opportunity. If there's going to be a general war, we may have to do it now. That was certainly very strong in Germany. The Germans were thinking, I think, rather like the Japanese in 1941, if we don't take on Russia now, or in the case of the Japanese, the United States will never be able to do it. And so you do get pressures. In the end, the crisis happens. You all know the steps. The assassination takes place at Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary determines that this time Serbia will be destroyed, and that is very, very clear. The Germans give Austria-Hungary a blank check. The Austro-Hungarians give an ultimatum to Serbia. The Germans back them up. The ultimatum is designed to be impossible for Serbia to accept, and the Serbs begin to face the consequences of an action which I think they knew very well was going to happen. The Russians begin to mobilize because they feel they can't let Serbia down as they have done before. They feel that their status and prestige as a great power depends on it. Russia mobilizes. The Germans mobilize. The Germans, as we know, have a two-front war. They ask the French to remain neutral in a last desperate attempt to avoid that two-front war and a general war, saying to the French, to show us that you are well inclined towards us, would you please hand over your frontier forts to us? And the French decide that this is not something they can do. And so by August the 4th, there is a general war in Europe. I think it is a result of the previous history. It's a result of the previous crises. In a funny way, the previous crises leave them with a feeling, I think, that we got through those crises over Morocco, crises over Bosnia-Herzegovina, crises in the Balkans. We got through them. Here's another one. It's not great, but we'll get through it again. And that in itself, I think, is one of the factors that leads to the failure, I think, because it's as much an act of omission, I think, as commission. I mean, there's those who wanted war, but there are those who fail to take the prospects seriously enough until it's too late. And in the end, of course, and it's horrible to think this, it may just have been an awful muddle. It may have been a mistake. I don't think the British intended that there should be a general war. I'm not sure that the Germans really wanted a general war. Part of the problem was just the timing. It all took place in the summer holidays. People were away, they were out of touch, and by the time it got too serious, they didn't know what to do. And I'll end with the other joke, which you've probably heard, that after a month of war, a headline comes out, Archduke found alive, war a mistake. Who knows? Thank you. So I'll stop here if that's all right.
Margaret, just on a point of general background, especially in view of the anniversary that's coming up, how does the Barbara Tuchman book hold up in your...
Well, I should be able to answer that because I read it as an undergraduate, and I thought it was wonderful, and I haven't dared read it since because she's so persuasive, and I want to write my book before I read it. I think I don't agree with her that it was sort of just happened. I think she does see the timetables as leading them to destruction, but I'm not going to read it till I finished writing mine.
Michael Dobbs?
Yes, I wanted to ask you something that touches on your thinking about uses and abuses of history. You probably know that actually, you mentioned Barbara Tuchman. President Kennedy had been reading Barbara Tuchman a few months before the missile crisis, and he was very influenced by the lessons of the First World War as she explained them. And part of his actions in the missile crisis was a determination to avoid the same consequences as in the First World War. In the run-up to the war in Iraq, President Bush cited President Kennedy in the missile crisis and cited Kennedy's action imposing the blockade and so on as justification for a preemptive action in the event of a mortal threat to the United States. Okay, so there are two presidents there who have drawn lessons from history. Can you comment on how valid these lessons are when lessons are useful and when history is used properly and when history is abused?
I think generally history is used properly when it makes you aware of possibilities and it helps you to formulate questions. I think where I always get uneasy is when people say I'm looking for the lessons of history as if there is some clear blueprint back there, that you pull out the blueprint for pre-war situations 101 and it will help you in any similar situation. I mean, I just don't think it works like that. I think what Kennedy took that was very useful from the Barbara Tuchman book was that you can get into a situation where it's difficult to back out and it's too late to back out. And I think what he did, and he was very clever in the way he dealt with the Russians. He didn't impose a blockade. He called it a quarantine. No one quite knew what that meant, and I'm not sure but there's something to be said for that, and I'm not sure he did either. But he left the Russians an out. I mean, he did give them his bottom demands. He didn't want new weapons coming to Cuba, and he wanted them to remove their nuclear weapons. At the same time, however, he was opening back channels to Russia. So he was trying to find a way that would make it possible for Russia to back down rather than boxing it into a corner. And I think I may be wrong, and you probably all know much more about this. I think with the Iraq War, there was no intention of letting Saddam Hussein get out of a corner. I mean, the intention was to put him in a corner and keep him there so there would be a war. But I think what the outbreak of World War I shows is the danger of sort of issuing ultimatums and making statements from which you can't back down, or you can only back down with great difficulty. What I think the First World War also shows, and I think this is where Kennedy again may have picked up something from Barbara Tuchman, because what he did was bring everyone in. I mean, he had the ex-com meeting sort of daily, and there wasn't as much danger as there had been in 1914 of people not knowing in the military the German military didn't know what the German Navy had up its sleeve, and the German Navy didn't know what the German military were planning. And I think what Kennedy was very concerned to avoid was not having enough information, who had planned what and making sure it was coordinated. And I think that's where history can be helpful. I mean, I don't think history ever teaches you anything very clear about avoiding trouble in the future, but it gives you some warning signals. And there's no other way of seeing the future. I mean, I don't think. Political scientists may disagree with me, but short of slaughtering geese like the Romans did and looking at the entrails, I think history can help us simply saying there might be trouble ahead if you do such and such, and that's better than nothing. But I'm very chary of great claims for the lessons of history myself.
Great. Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to ask two quick questions. One, when people always study these wars and what happened, how these things unfolded, But one of the key questions a lot of historians try to tap into, whether it's the American Civil War or World War I, is was there a moment or a week or a day or something that it could have stopped, that they could have, your statement a little bit before saying that there's a certain point where there's so much blood spilt that there's no way back. But was there a moment when there was a way back, and yet for some reason it just, like you say, muddled on and created a catastrophe? And number two, real quick, is from what I understand, traveling to Europe, and I talked to a lot of people, and one of the things in England that someone mentioned to me caught my ear was that one of the reasons why it was such a profound experience in England, World War I, is that because the nature of the press hid the nature of the losses. And that after World War I, there was the impression that a lot of these guys would come home and so forth, and eventually, after a few months, they realized the massive losses that took place, and that even affected Churchill in World War II, that he refused to go across the English Channel when he was first asked about it by Roosevelt, because of the memory of the huge losses that England had to incur.
Okay. The moment when it could have stopped, I think, at the moment, but I may change my thinking, in the run-up to the outbreak of the war, I think it was the German mobilization. Russian mobilization was bad enough, but the Russians were still back from the frontiers. And I think, if Germany had not attacked France, Russia would not have attacked Germany. The German war plan, and of course there's endless disputes about that as well. I mean, there's a whole new controversy over whether there was something called the Schlieffen Plan or not, but I tend to think there was. But the German war plan was from 1914 onwards for a two-front war. Up until 1913, they'd had plans for a one-front war against Russia only. And they knew that France wasn't going to attack them. I mean, the French had been defeated. The last thing the French wanted at this point was a war, but they were worried about Russia, which was arming very fast and expanding very fast. And in 1913, they abandoned their plans for a one-front war against Russia. And from that point on, they only had a two-front war, which meant attacking quickly in France, knocking France out, and then switching their forces to the Russian front, because Russia would take longer to defeat. I think once Germany had mobilized and set in track the attacks on Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and then the defensive stance in Russia, it was probably impossible. Once the war was on, what was very difficult, and this is, I think, one of the unfortunate effects of fighting with mass armies and democracy, it was extremely difficult for governments to turn around to their publics who had supported the war generally from the beginning. I mean, the divisions that the elites feared simply didn't appear. There was, at least at first, a sort of unity in most European countries. Very difficult for them to turn around and say, look, where we've ended up in a stalemate, we've already lost. And the first months of the war took the heaviest losses proportionately of any period of the war. We've ended up in a stalemate. Yes, we have lost several thousand or hundreds of thousands of people, and we haven't gained anything, but we think it was a mistake and we're going to make peace. It was almost impossible for them to say that. Plus they had, I mean, the German military, who become more and more powerful during the war, I think would have accepted nothing less than hanging on to Belgium and the coast. So I think it became very difficult to stop. As the losses mounted, it became harder and harder to stop. As far as the losses go, no, people knew about the losses. I mean, people were informed when their loved ones had died or when they were missing in action. What people didn't properly appreciate was the nature of war on the Western Front. I mean, it was very difficult for the home front to understand it. I mean, if you read All Quiet on the Western Front, partly they didn't want to hear about it. They wanted to think their boys were out there fighting a glorious war, and partly the press was tightly controlled. But certainly the memory of those losses affected policymakers in Britain and France. It did not affect, however, the Germans. Hitler, well, once the Nazis were in power, Hitler was prepared to take whatever losses were necessary to establish German dominance. So it affected democratic societies, certainly. And if you look at the way the Second World War was fought, the British were very, very careful how they used their soldiers. And, of course, the memory of the losses helped to really weaken the French resolve to fight ever again. So I know you're right on that.
Stanley Falk? Hold on.
What do you think of the proposition that's been recently made about Russian motivation, that the Russians were really not interested anymore in protecting Serbia, but that they saw this as a means of dominating Turkey and getting control of the Straits?
That was a long-standing Russian goal, of course, but they already had pretty good access through the States. I mean, there had been a number of international conventions, and of course they were if not allied to Britain, they were now part of the Triple Entente with Britain, and the British had made it clear that they were no longer going to prop up Turkey. And so I think from Russia's point of view, they had the free access through the straits, or they were getting very close to free access for their military shipping. They already had it for the mercantile shipping. I'm not sure that was their concern so much. I mean, I think with Serbia, I mean, I don't believe all the pan-Slavic stuff. I mean, that there was that movement in Russia, but I think it was more a question of great power prestige. They were on very bad terms with Austria-Hungary. They were afraid of Germany. No, I think it was foolish for Russia to go into the war. I think they should have let Serbia go, quite frankly, because they were actually doing. I mean, Russia's one of the great what-ifs. I mean, if you're doing alternative histories, I mean, it was doing very well. I mean, goodness knows it had terrible strains, but it was expanding very quickly. Literacy was increasing. Its economy was one of the fastest growing in the world, if not the fastest growing in the world. It was industrializing at a great rate. If it had not been for its entry into the First World War, it would have had a very different trajectory, I think. And it is possible that even Nicholas II, feeble as he was, would have conceded some form of constitutional government. I mean, I think he already was under tremendous pressure to do that. But I think, you get into curious questions of honor. We're a great power. Can we back down? How can we be a great power if we don't defend the people we say we're going to defend? I haven't read, I mean, Sean McMeekin hasn't published his new book. I tend to be skeptical of his argument the Russians were hell-bent on a war. I mean, they just recovered from the Russo-Japanese War, which very nearly brought the whole system down. So I think they were not in favor of a war. But in the end, when it came to it, there were a few people who said we have to do it. And the Tsar was pressured. I mean, the Tsar wobbled. I mean, he changed his mind. When he finally gave the order for mobilization, his war minister phoned the chief of the Russian staff and said, look, the order has come for mobilization, and my advice to you is break your telephone, because the Tsar is going to change his mind again. So.
All right, Charles Smith.
I just had a comment on the comparison of Cuba and Iraq, which is very interesting, because my brother was tracking naval and Soviet submarines from Nantucket, and we could track their submarines electronically. And this is a case where we let the Soviets know that we knew what was going on, and our destroyers actually dropped depth charges on a submarine down in the Caribbean to let them know, so they could let Moscow know if something like this is going on. Whereas with Iraq, you had people in the Bush administration who had called for Saddam Hussein's removal as early as 1996, and Cheney and Rumsfeld had signed an open letter to Clinton in 1998 about this. So you had people really committed here, and that argument would go on. But with respect to what you're talking about here, a lot of the tensions that were resolved, Morocco, for example, a final one, were about other people's territory.
Yeah.
And when you're getting into your own territory in Europe, you might say Serbia is an outlier to an extent, but there is the sense that we can't back down. And you left one war out that was very brief, but I think the Franco-Prussian War.
Yeah.
In terms of what that meant for Germany's power coming up, and the French attitude about this and what might happen in the future, and the legacy of that war.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk more about that in terms of general mistrust, not just fear, but mistrust of each other, and what might happen if we let this go on without acting.
Yeah, I think that is the danger. If we let it go on, if we don't act this time, then next time someone's going to try something even bigger. And pretty much all the colonial disputes had been settled by 1914. Even China, which had looked at one point as though it were going to cause trouble between the powers, they'd more or less come to an agreement that there should be an open door policy. And the fact that there'd been a revolution in 1911 gave less excuse, even though it resulted in a military dictatorship a bit later on, but it gave less excuse for intervention. So I think it comes back into Europe, I think. And I think that the Balkans are, as they have been since, a sort of flashpoint, because it's where the interests of other powers meet. And I think there was a problem in the Balkans. And you also got really aggressive Balkan nationalism. I mean, I think you can't blame Serbia for the First World War, but the Serbs certainly helped to light the match. And I think the Serbian government knew but was unable to control the activities of the Black Hand and Colonel Apis, who they later on dealt with simply by assassinating quietly. He was a very difficult character indeed. Sorry, your second point was about the Franco-Prussian War. I think, it has been thought for some time, and clearly the result of the Franco-Prussian War it's in two stages. I mean, the first bit's military. The second bit really is more a people's war against the Prussians. And that should have been a warning, because you get an enraged French nationalism, and the French actually keep fighting on longer than even the French government had intended. But what it leads to, of course, is the creation of this big Germany with all the consequences. I mean, there's now a real German question in Europe. But recent historiography suggests that the French, we've all heard about the French desire for revenge. And the statues of Alsace and Lorraine draped in black and so on. Recent historians' work seems to show that the French basically had accepted the loss of Alsace and Lorraine. They didn't like it, but they didn't want another war. And French society had been really badly shaken by the Dreyfus affair. It had left the military much weakened. There was always tension between the Republican government and the military. And so I think the French felt they simply weren't ready for a war. They didn't want a war. Their alliance with Russia was, from the French point of view, defensive, and I think also from the Russian point of view, defensive, of course, from the German point of view. That's always the trouble with defensive alliances. They are defensive to you and offensive to someone else. And, of course, the Germans, far from feeling themselves to be a great power at the heart of Europe, felt themselves to be encircled. Someone said Germany was born encircled. So, you do get this problem of, it's very important in international relations, the problems of perceptions. You may feel yourself to be a weak, poor little thing, but you're seen as a great threat to someone else. You might be surprised in the United States to know that sometimes in Canada we see you as a threat. I'm sure you don't ever feel that. And you never, alas, feel that we're a threat, I think. But I think it is, I think I don't think that the French didn't want war. The British certainly didn't want war. What I think is also interesting in the steps towards war, which I didn't mention, is the countries where there was civilian control of the military made, it seems to me, much more rational decisions. I mean, what you got in Germany was Bethmann Hollweg at a certain point saying, well, it's up to the military to decide. And the military plans had serious political implications. The plan to invade Belgium, of course, was politically disastrous and strategically disastrous. Well, strategically made sense, politically made no sense. In Russia, there was very little civilian control. What you also had in both Germany and Russia and Austria-Hungary, too, was people simply not knowing what other branches of the government were doing. There wasn't a cabinet system. They never all met. Tirpitz says in his memoirs, and while they're highly unreliable, you can't believe every word he says because he blames everyone else except himself for what went wrong. But he says in his memoirs he did not know on August the 2nd, 1914, that there was a Schlieffen Plan. He didn't know that the German military were planning a two-front war. He said, we never talked about it. But it didn't surprise me that. I think it's perfectly plausible that he didn't know. And so I think, that there are very interesting questions raised in the outbreak of the First World War about who was actually deciding, and the lack of coherence in countries such as Germany and Russia is really striking. People simply not knowing what another very important part of the government was doing.
Sure.
Two brief questions. The first is, you were giving this talk on the week of the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. Are there any analogies to be made? And my second question is, Niall Ferguson has mentioned that Britain should basically have allowed the Germans to reach the Channel and done nothing. Is this a realistic counterfactual, or simply did Britain really have no logical choice but to go to war against the Second Reich when Belgian neutrality had been violated?
Very interesting. As far as the Titanic goes, I don't know if I'm like everyone else. I'm suffering from Titanic overload. I think if I read one more thing about the Titanic, I don't know why. I suppose it grips our imagination so much because it was so powerful, it was so much cutting edge, and it went so badly wrong. And I think there is, great catastrophes do cause great attention. I suppose with the Titanic, there was, if you look at the sequence of decisions, once they'd hit the iceberg, there simply was an inability to comprehend that something serious had happened because they were assuming the Titanic was unsinkable. And if you're thinking like this, you don't then take serious steps when it begins to sink. As far as Neil Ferguson goes, I've actually had a couple of discussions or arguments. You never win an argument. Don't never get into an argument with Neil Ferguson. He's very good at arguing. But we've had a couple of discussions, and I think, the British had a choice. They always had a choice. And it was taken very, very late. It was a very difficult choice. There were a number of cabinet meetings. It was a proper civilian cabinet choice, and a number of people in the cabinet had to be persuaded that a war was necessary. So it was a very, very serious matter, and I think properly done, even though you may disagree with the result. My sense is that if Britain had stayed out of the war, the great possibility, I mean, Germany nearly won in the opening months. If it had not been for the First Battle of the Marne, possibly the British Expeditionary Force, which the Germans didn't take seriously, but the Schlieffen Plan might have worked, and then France would have sued for peace, possibly. Russia then would have been left on its own. It would have had to make some sort of deal. Again, we don't know. But, I mean, the Schlieffen Plan came close to succeeding. If it had succeeded, without Britain being part of it all, Britain would then have been facing what it has never wanted in its history, a Germany dominated by one strong power. Moreover, the crucial coast being dominated. Because I doubt that the Netherlands would have remained independent for very long. Belgium would have been taken. And in fact, by the fall of 1914, it was at least the plan of significant elements in the German Foreign Office and the German military to annex Belgium, particularly the sea coast of Belgium. The Germans would have controlled the French coast. I'm sure they would have taken the coast of the north of France, as they did if you look at the division of France in the Second World War. And so Britain would have been facing a Europe dominated by one power, and that's something that Britain has never wanted on Europe. It would have affected Britain's position in the world. It would have affected its trade. It would have affected its ability to control the crucial sea lanes which it needed to maintain its trade and keep in touch with its empire. And I also think the Germany that would have emerged, if it did emerge, had it emerged victorious from that war, would not have been a very pleasant Germany. But Bismarck had left a new state with a very imperfect constitution. It left far too much power in the hands of the Kaiser, whoever happened to be ruling. He was Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. He was in charge of foreign policy. Now, he often didn't exercise it because he was too lazy in the case of Wilhelm II. But I think it was imperfectly governed. I think you would have had a triumphalist Germany. German nationalism, I think, would have been really, running on a high. And it wouldn't have been a Nazi Germany, but I think it would have been a pretty uncomfortable neighbor for Britain. So my view, this is what I said to Neil Ferguson, I don't think he agreed with me, is that, in fact, it was a real risk for Britain. It would have been a real risk to sit back and let it happen, because the long-term prospects wouldn't have been good.
Tom Hughes, up front here. No, first we'll go up here. Sorry. We'll go up here first to Tom Hughes.
Staying on the English factor for a minute, what do you make of attitudes in Berlin in July 1914, August, about England? The calculation obviously was that the British wouldn't intervene. And the people who knew England, or thought they knew England, from the Kaiser to Bateman Holway, who had a son at Oxford and so forth, seemed to be confident of this. I mean, Prince Henry talks to George V, the rest of it. Did the military did they simply say there's some doubt that the British will intervene? What was the Berlin calculation, if any, on the certainty or lack of certainty of British intervention?
Yeah. It's such an interesting question. It was something the Germans, of course, the German leadership talked about at intervals before 1914. The attitude seems to have been, a lot of people seem to have thought the British won't come in. And, it's quite true. The British didn't know they were going to come in till very late. I mean, even the violation of Belgian neutrality needn't have been a casus belli. The British had signed a treaty to protect Belgian neutrality, but again, as in all international agreements, there's no enforcer. You can break it if it's in your interest to do so. And the British could have found some way out of it, I think. They could have accepted the German argument that Belgium was about to attack them, and therefore Germany had to attack Belgium, whatever. So there were quite a few people in Berlin who thought it was unlikely that Britain would come in. But the attitude was that even if they did come in, so what? The war will be over quickly if our plan works. It's a gamble. So if the British impose a blockade on us, it will take time for it to bite. And, of course, as a continental power, Germany would be less affected by a blockade. Although the Germans feared it, they would be less affected by a blockade than say, Britain would have been in a similar situation. And the German military seemed to have dismissed the British as a fighting force. I mean, they were afraid of the British Navy, but the British Expeditionary Force they thought was too small. They didn't think the British could fight. They didn't think the British were good soldiers. In fact, a number of the German military said, bring them on. We'll defeat them. We look forward to it. We can take them on. Contemptible little army. It's not going to make any difference. And it was small. I mean, the British did not have a conscript army, so it was very small by the standards of the mass European armies. In fact, I think it can be argued, and I'm not a military historian, but it can be argued that the British Expeditionary Force, in fact, did make a difference I mean, it provided crucial support for the left wing of French forces nearest the Channel and as the battle was unfolding in August. And it helped to slow up the advance that was predicted or expected in the Schlieffen Plan. But generally in Berlin, I think combination of wishful thinking, the British won't come in, and perhaps, rightly, not because the British didn't know they were going to come in, and also a sense, well, even if they come in, who cares? We can deal with it.
Thank you. Jim Banner?
Professor Mcmillan, can I take you back to the beginning? Because I want to make certain that I understand the position you were taking or trying to take. As I understand it, you're trying to distinguish what is going to be your forthcoming book from 33,000 others, or whatever number you cited.
Yeah.
And you did so by disavowing an interest in pinning responsibility on one party or the other.
Yeah.
It does seem to me that you've been talking throughout with subtlety, and as far as I can tell, and I think conditions that led to war.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about causes.
Yeah.
Without.
Yeah.
When all is said and done, one has to conclude that there were some set of circumstances, some triggers, some acts, some decisions that brought about the Holocaust of the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that without assessing responsibility to some degree?
Yeah. I take your point. I think my main purpose is not to assign blame and not to try and answer that question. I mean, I'm more interested in trying to understand what they thought they were doing when they made those decisions. And I hope as I go on I'll get a clearer sense of how the war actually happened. But I'm going back quite far. I mean, I think you can't understand 1914 without understanding at least the preceding 10 or 15 years. Because what happened then colors their decisions in 1914, their memories of what has happened in the preceding years and their assumptions which grow out of that period and their own life experiences, I think, are very important. I mean, I certainly would assign some responsibility. I think what I don't want to do, it just seems to me you never get an answer, who in the end started the First World War? And I can't answer that question. I'm not even sure I want to try. I mean, I really want to look at how it became possible and why what should have been, given the tremendous advances in Europe, it should have become unthinkable, as many people in the middle classes and on the liberal side and the left side and the working classes thought, should have become inconceivable. And why was it conceivable? Why were they still thinking in these terms? Why were they still conceiving of war? Why did the attempts to deter war fail or to block war fail? But there's certain, you can see the factors that lead towards it, and of course it's always easier looking back. But the Anglo-German naval race, I mean, what on earth the Germans thought they were doing to try and build a navy that would challenge the British? And I mean, I've been reading Tirpitz's memoirs, which I recommend if you have trouble sleeping. No, but he just goes on, and none of it's my fault, and the British, the British betrayed us by taking up the challenge. I mean, he's totally unreasonable, and none of it's his fault. It's everyone else's fault. It's all his colleagues' fault, and if only they'd listened to him, it all would have been all right. But what he thought he was doing, I've been trying to understand the Tirpitz risk theory, and this famous theory that we will build a navy that will challenge the British. It will not match the British Navy, but what it will do is be big enough that the British Navy won't want to take us on, because if they take us on, they'll lose some ships, and then they'll be weak when another navy decides to attack them. Now this is, and so the British, therefore, seeing that they can't be at odds with us because they don't dare contemplate a war with us, they'll become friends with us. And how he can have thought this, and how he cannot have imagined the British would actually say, okay, the Germans are going to build a big navy, we'll have to outbuild them. And the Germans want to build a big navy, so we'll have to find allies. We'll have to abandon what had been a very successful policy of non-involvement, or not non-involvement, non-committal. It wasn't isolation. They called it splendid isolation, but it wasn't isolation. But they had simply refused to pick sides. They had very carefully maneuvered throughout most of the 19th century, intervening only when they felt it was necessary. But why he thought the British would not react, as they did, first by outbuilding the Germans, and secondly by looking for friends, first, of course, with Japan and then with France and Russia. But, in all things, you get failures of imagination. I mean, people don't put themselves into the shoes of the other person. and I think they didn't. But you're right. I am talking about responsibility, but what I don't want to do is get into endless things of who said what when and whose fault it was. And, every moment, of course, in July 1914 is argued about. Did this telegram come in time? And did the Russian ambassador or did the German ambassador in London say to Sir Edward Grey, or did Sir Edward Grey say to him? And, I'm not sure we're ever going to know. And I'm not sure those are the interesting questions. And I'm trying really just to do a narrative history for a new generation. And I hope they want to buy it when I write it.
Very well. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I think everybody here has enjoyed it. I have a question. I was particularly excited about your discussion of sort of the psychological/emotional sort of climate in which the elites were making the decisions to go to war, basically, or seeing war as an option. And it reminded me of an argument put forward by the American historian Kristen Hoganson about the lead up to the Spanish-American War. And she talks about sort of similar fears and similar anxieties, that society's out of whack and that what you need is war as a purifying force to, sort of bring us back to our true values again. And she also talks about sort of this crisis of American manhood. And I was just wondering, to what extent do you find sort of like, is there a sort of a gendered sort of thing going on amongst your guys in Europe as well?
Yeah. I think, there is a very interesting thing, I think. There is a feeling that we're getting degenerate and weak and soft. And Bethmann Hollweg says a very interesting thing. In August 1914, he says, for us not to confront Russia now and France now would be an act of self-castration, which is a curious choice of term, isn't it? It is. So I do think there's something in this. I mean, I think we go on and on about the changes we're living through. I mean, we go on about the electronic revolution, which is a huge change. But I think the people who lived from, say, roughly 1850, 1860 up to 1914 or later underwent the most enormous changes in their lives. With sort of the spread of mass transportation, mass communications, growth of cities. I mean, the explosive growth of cities. I mean, I was looking at it the other day. I mean, European cities are not just doubling in size, they're tripling and quadrupling. I mean, Budapest is 200,000 people in 1800. It's over 1 million in 1900. And this poses real challenges. And I think there is a fear that people are getting soft. And the British were very worried when they began looking at the health of their public. And they thought, we don't have people who can be soldiers. They've got knock knees and they have rickets. And in fact, one of the impulses behind improving public health was, in fact, to bring the health of the population up. And it's when you also get in this period the eugenics movement, that we have to weed out the unfit because the unfit are surviving thanks to modern progress in modern medicine. So I think there is a very interesting sense that somehow we're weakening. And I think, the whole, now I think of it, there's that sort of slightly dark side to the whole fascination with the classics. All those English public school boys learning Greek and Latin and learning about, reading Homer. A sense that there was a clearer, straighter world back there. And if you look at the fiction of the time and the popular boys' fiction, popular girls' fiction was more about being good little nurses, but popular boys' fiction is about, heroic figures around the world. I mean, I don't know how many of you ever read G.A. Henty, who wrote endless novels. You only need read one because the plot's always the same. It's poor but noble boy catches attention of Kitchener in Khartoum, Clive in India, Wolfe at Quebec, and fortune is made. And rich but bad boy comes to his just deserts. But so I think it is an interesting question. There was a real fear about the future of the race.
Thank you. Gentleman over here, thanks for your patience.
Hi, Chalmers Hood. 2 pieces of evidence. I wonder if you can plug them into your matrix. One, you've gotten around the edge of it, but you haven't touched on the Pan-German League, the way Fisher uses it, its importance in your matrix. And second, an odd thing, what do you think of how Attenborough interpreted it in What a Lovely War?
The Pan-German, I mean, I think Fritz Fischer's thesis was that Germany was bent on making a war, and he ascribes responsibility to Germany, and as you know, it was hugely controversial and caused a great furore in Germany when it first came out. And he had uncovered very interesting evidence. The problem always is how you weigh the evidence. I mean, for example, there was this much discussed, it was called the War Council of December 1912, where the Kaiser met a number of his top advisors in one of his castles outside Berlin, and they talked about the prospects of war. Now, how seriously do you take that? Is that just people talking? or is it a real war plan? And I would argue, I tend to come down on the side of saying they were talking around the subject, but they weren't actually planning a war. I mean, it seems to me very much how you deal with Richard Nixon. You know, if you take all his marginal notes and his comments, you know, how much do you discount them? How much do you discount what people say in conversation? And there clearly were those in Germany who were contemplating a war and perhaps planning for a war, but there were also a great many people who weren't. And the Pan-German League was an ultranationalist league talking about annexations, talking about the spread of Germanhood and Germandom and so on. But again, it was one among many public opinion groups. And there was also a very big SPD, very big Social Democratic Party in Germany. So I tend to come down on the side of saying that, you know, you can find evidence for almost anything if you look back. And you could look back and find evidence for, you know, widespread peace movement and nobody wanting war. You can find evidence for people wanting war. My own feeling is, yes, there were certainly those who did not shrink from the prospect of war, who thought that war might be necessary to achieve certain ends, but there are also a great many people who didn't want war. Among them, I am increasingly coming to think Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was one of these interesting people who talked way too much, said a lot of very stupid things, sounded very belligerent. But when you looked at him in crises, the two Moroccan crises, the Bosnian crisis, the Balkan Wars, he's on the side of peace. He doesn't want to get into war. He gets very, very twitchy about that. As far as Oh, What a Lovely War goes, I loved it when I saw it. It was a wonderfully cynical approach, and at a necessary time. I mean, there was a tendency to sort of elevate the First World War to this glorious, heroic thing, and this was very much a debunking exercise. It was brilliant theater. As far as evidence, I'm not sure where it goes, but it certainly was fun to see.
Thank you. We're here at the home of the Cold War National History Project that I've run for the last decade and a half, and we're obsessing about new evidence. So my short question is there new evidence, new documentation on World War I? But let me, because we'd like to bring this to a close not too far beyond 5:30, let me call on the gentleman there, and then fittingly Arnita Jones, the former executive director of the IHA, will pose the last question. Why don't we take those two questions and then give Professor Mcmillan one final chance to round out the discussion. Yeah.
Well, hopefully it's not too far out of, I guess, a geographic area, but one power that we did not talk about was the Ottoman Empire. And they always seemed to me to be the most logical for actually joining up in the war, since they weren't necessarily bound by treaties in July. It seemed that for them, well, I guess I was asking your opinion of why did they join in the first place? There are quite a variety of reasons that you listed, and any one of them could have been applied. But in the end, it did seem even more so than Austria-Hungary a suicidal exercise for a power that had been so roundly beaten so many times recently.
Yeah.
Thank you. Arnita?
My question is whether there was any discussion in those days in July and August that the United States could ever possibly be drawn into the war.
Oh, okay.
And when did it begin?
Okay. Both really interesting questions. On the Ottoman Empire, I think it came into the war. It was a very small group of people making the decision. It was the Committee of Union and Progress, and I think they came in very, really, I think in a very materialistic way. They thought that the Central Powers would win, rather like Italy came in when they thought the Entente powers were going to win. I mean, they came in for their own calculations. They were extremely concerned about Russia. Germany had very carefully cultivated them over the previous years, had appeared a friend, had helped to train their military, was selling them 2 dreadnoughts. So I think there was a feeling that Germany was not only going to win, and remember this was November 1914, when although there was a stalemate, the Germans were basically occupying the north of France and Belgium. So it looked, when the fighting started again, I think it was assumed that Germany probably would win. So it was a calculation which, of course, went badly wrong. I think they also saw it as a counterbalance to their old enemy of Russia. There were pressures on their border, their common border between Russia, where the Armenian populations were scattered, among others. And I think it was also a failure of Allied diplomacy. I mean, the British mishandled it. They had managed to alienate the Ottomans over the previous decade or so. So I think they came in really, I think, you're right, it was a very foolish decision. It led to their destruction because they were even shakier than Russia was. Of course, they didn't have the nationalities issue yet that the Russians had. I mean, the Russians already had a Polish nationalities issue, but the Arab national issue was only beginning. It wasn't really going to become, I think, more important. But they had been cultivated by Germany, and I think Germany was promising them a lot, and I think they saw something to be gained, possibly even gaining back territory in the Balkans. You never know. As far as U.S. involvement goes, no discussion I've seen among the statesmen, but there was discussion among people. Geostrategy was a new term, and the Germans are very keen on geopolitics. And there was a sense that one day Germany might have to take on the United States, and that there might one day be an Anglo-Saxon union against them. And there was certainly talk about, again, in Britain and also in the United States, about how the Anglo-Saxon peoples might get together. But sometimes that included the Germans. There was sometimes talk of the Teutonic peoples forming a front, United States, British Empire, or Britain plus the white bits of the British Empire, such as Canada, and Germany. And you see it in Cecil Rhodes' will. I mean, he thought there was some sort of unity. There were Rhodes scholars from Germany before the First World War, not to be reinstated again until a bit later. So I think there was consideration of the United States as a coming power, but I don't think in 1914 anyone had any serious thoughts of involving the United States as a combatant, because most of the war plans assumed the war would be over quickly. And it was only as the stalemate developed that it became important. And of course, as the issue of supplies became particularly important to Britain, I mean, the British began to take very, very seriously the prospects of bringing the United States in, which is a whole other wonderful, which Barbara Tuchman's written that wonderful book on the Zimmerman telegram. On the new evidence, there is still some new evidence. The Russian archives are more open, and the Russians have been returning some of the materials they took from Germany at the end of the Second World War. I visited the Serbian National Archives, which is an interesting experience. They showed me the telegram that had been sent by Austria to Serbia saying, "Time's up, we're declaring war." And I think there may be stuff in the Serbian archives, but it's still rather difficult to get at. I don't think they're great caches of documents, and of course a lot's been destroyed. The German general staff records were destroyed in the Second World War, and so it's a lot of very important stuff has simply gone. And people did burn diaries. And there's still things I think we'll never know. I mean, the French president and foreign minister went to St. Petersburg in July 1914 on a state visit. And it was an unfortunate timing because they were out of radio contact for quite a bit. And they did have meetings with the Russians, and no one really knows what was said in those meetings. Sean McMeekin is arguing in his most recent book that the Russians must have and the French must have decided on war, but I'm not sure. We just don't know. So there are black holes, there are holes in the evidence. And so I don't think there's going to be any great new amount coming, but there will be bits and pieces that will be interesting.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, let's thank Professor Mcmillan for a tremendous presentation.